Buying the right motherboard is hard. This is why this video is supposed to help you choose. But first things first, a better motherboard does not increase your performance, at least in theory. You are going to have the same performance with any motherboard no matter what. Obviously, the rest of the system has to be the same though. But that is only going to be the case if your CPU, for example, is operating within its specifications. Some motherboard vendors artificially raise some parameters, causing processors to boost higher than stock and in turn run hotter and use more power. Those options can be changed in almost any mainboard and are the cause of any major performance gains. Anything else will be in the 1 to 3% range and therefore is negligible. Obviously, overclocking options are a different thing in itself, but this is for baseline performance. So why do I want or need a more expensive motherboard then? Do I just buy the cheapest? Well, there are a few things to look out for when choosing. Number 1, socket, chipset and CPU support. First of all, you obviously have to choose one that has the socket you want. So for the most recent it would be socket 1700 for Intel or AM5 for AMD. Some really cheap motherboards have some CPU restrictions. For example, they will only support 65 watt CPUs, but in current socket motherboards or current chipset motherboards that isn't really the case. Obviously, some older units may not be compatible with the newest CPUs. For that, check the manufacturer's website if the CPU you want is only compatible with a later BIOS revision. The one you buy may not have that yet, and you will have to look for a way to flash a new UEFI onto it, either with a different compatible CPU or an auto flash feature, which incidentally all of the new AM5 motherboards do have. Then you want to have a look at the chipset. Most sockets have options for different chipsets that have different features. For example, AMD A-series chipsets miss overclocking support, so choose wisely which features you need now and may want in the future, such as PCI Express 5.0, DDR5 RAM, or even USB 20 gigabit or Thunderbolt. And most of the time, especially on AMD, the mid-tier one is the best choice. After chipset and socket, obviously, the next thing you have to look for is what ports do you want. Do I need a few PCI Express slots or just one? Do you need more than 2 M.2 slots? This is all important, although there is things to look out for, especially on M.2 and PCIe slots. Of course, it's also important whether you need 2.5 or 5 gigabit Ethernet, 20 gigabit USB. Just choose the ones you want and you will get a smaller choice of motherboards. M.2 slots can be deceiving. While there may be 3 or 4 on the board, you may not be able to use everyone at the same speed, or for that you best look at the menu, because even if the slot is spec'd for 4.0 at X4 bandwidth, you may only be able to use it at X2 when other ports are used or when using a different CPU that has fewer PCI Express lanes, such as the G series on AM4. PCI Express slots in that regard are also similar. They may be a physical 16x slot but only support up to 8 or even 4x. There's also a difference if they are linked either to the CPU or the PCH. Same goes for M.2 slots. Slots linked to the PCH are not recommended for use with GPUs, as their bandwidth is limited and the latency is much larger than the ones linked directly to the CPU. In most cases, the first 2 physical 16x slots are linked to the CPU. And the third thing, components and VRM. Probably the most important things on a motherboard. Probably the most in-depth thing and complicated thing on a motherboard to choose. On the motherboard itself, there also can be some components that might be interesting. As said before, Ethernet chip might be interesting to look at, but also the audio codec might be worth looking at if you don't use a headset with USB or an external DAC. So make sure that the board has a decent audio chipset, such as at least the AOC 1220. And of course, the quality of the components for CPU power delivery are crucial to a good motherboard as well. This is why I'm going to explain what to look out for here as well, since this section is a bit more complicated. First of all, if you are not planning on overclocking at all, the VRM of the motherboards does not matter as much. As long as it's a motherboard that is somewhat above the $80 mark, the power delivery should be sufficient for any CPU on that socket running at stock speeds. Also, if you want to dive deeper into VRM stuff, I highly recommend the channel of Actually Hardware Overclocking. He breaks down the VRM on many motherboards in detail and does in-depth guides for overclocking. But I know also giving you a brief overview. But I will give you a brief overview of what to look out for. Firstly, it's not necessarily important how many phases or chokes a VRM on a motherboard has. Lots of manufacturers praise their boards with high phase counts, etc., but components that are used are also very important. As an example, we are going to take a look at the Asus TUF BFAR50 Plus, which uses a very common design among cheaper Asus boards under the $100 price point. This motherboard uses a 4+2 VRM design, which means 4 phases are handling the CPU and 2 are handling other stuff such as the iGPU, for example. The MOSFETs are 4C06N and 4C09N from ON Semiconductor. This is not really necessary to know, but it's just a context so that you know what we're looking at. Funny enough, these same parts are also used in more expensive motherboards like the Prime series, just with more phases this time, so the VRM can handle more power and be more efficient while under the same high load the smaller one would be at. These VRMs use high and low side MOSFETs to convert 12 volts into 1.x volts of the CPU and are rated for specific maximum current. In this case, 52 amps each, because we have 2 low side MOSFETs on each phase. So in theory, this board is capable of handling 208 amps in total, which would be equivalent to running a Ryzen CPU at 1.3 volts that pulls about 270 watts. Basically anything overclocked, even a 5950X on air and water cooling. But the problem is that this power output of these VRMs gets really inefficient. Like power supplies, for example, the efficiency curves looks a lot like this. So at 100% of their capability, this VRAM would produce somewhere around 50 watts of heat, which is impossible to cool with a normal VRM heatsink. They would be able to handle around 15 to 20 watts with some airflow on these lower end boards. So in this case, you would be looking at around 120 amps max, which would be about 150 watts power draw from the CPU. That in turn means a stock 16 core is in theory not a problem as long as it's ran within spec. Overclocking it or removing power limits completely will cause overheating issues. The maximum I would recommend on this board, for example, would be a 5800X with a mild overclock. Looking at the newer Pro version of this motherboard, which is seemingly better in VRM parts since it looks like it has 10 phases in total, well, it's the same as before, just with more chokes. So it looks like it is more high-end. Effectively, this is just the same 4+2 phase design from before with almost the same components on it. But don't worry, almost every manufacturer does that. Just have a look under the cooler what it actually is and don't get fooled by the phase count or the choke count. Looking at quite a more high-end motherboard for around $300 to have a better example of a VRM that is actually very good. In this case, the B650EF Strix Wi-Fi. This board is using a doubled 6+2 phase, which is not to be confused by the previous VRM that was just using 2 chokes. This is actually using double of every component, which in turn also means it has much bigger capacity. The reason why it is doubled is that the VRM controller that handles the switching of the MOSFETs can only handle 6 phases, and therefore it has to be done like this. This is not a big problem, as it is just means that the VRM is slightly less efficient and therefore capable than a full 12 phase, but at the total capacity that would not be a big deal. So this board has SiC 659 power stages, which should be capable of a max of 80 amps times 12. That would be 960 amps. Amazing, right? Well, in this case, there are no specs for this part, and the manufacturer does not have anything with these specs in his catalog, only 60 amp phases, which would also be more than enough for this VRM. In this case, the 80 amp rating could also just be a burst rating for short durations of load, so we will go off of a 60 amp part with continuous rating. Because the 659 may be an ASUS only part, we will go off of the spec from the 645, which is still very good and also an excellent example of a pretty much bulletproof VRM design. Using a 7950X, which is a 16 core as an example, which has a stock current limit of about 160 amps or 129 watts at 1.2 volts, this VRM will handle this easily without much stress. At 200 amps, which would be the absolute maximum overclock on air or water cooling for this CPU, it will produce around 17 watts of heat, which won't be a problem for the massive cooler found on this motherboard. That will be able to handle about 30 watts with some decent airflow. For the VRM to reach this heat output though, the CPU would have to draw around 400 watts or 300 amps, which is a lot even when extreme overclocking with liquid nitrogen. Also, the 960 amps are kind of misleading because when pulling 500 amps from the VRM alone would produce 66 watt of heat itself already, and it would only be getting worse the higher you go. So 960 or even 720 amps is not really realistic. So this VRM is basically overkill for any normal or enthusiast user, which is good, since a high VRM capacity aids in good voltage regulation and therefore helps with achieving higher stable frequencies when overclocking, as there are less spikes or dips in the voltage. This also has to do with other components on the board, but I will not go in depth into that. For this, as I said, you can go look at actually hardware overclocking. There you will find more infos about VRM, voltage regulation and extreme overclocking. Well, I hope this helped you somewhat choosing the right motherboard for you, so you know what to look out for and especially, well, what to stay away from. And yeah, if you have any further questions or want to see more videos like this, leave a comment below, and otherwise, have a nice day. Bye.